Hello everyone, my name is Mo Hussain. I'm a 1L dual JD student at the University of Windsor and University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. And welcome to Billable Time with Mo Hussain. You like that name? Because Billable Time. Okay, maybe not. You'll get it soon. Basically, this podcast is about me loving to just talk to people that are law students, professors, anyone else involved in the legal industry, and just learning more and just getting enlightened and getting different tips on how to navigate sort of the legal journey and stuff like that. So I'm really, really excited to just start this series. And the first episode is with my contracts prof, Professor Christopher Waters. Great episode, great guy. Hope you guys enjoy it. Like, share, subscribe, and follow me on LinkedIn, follow me on YouTube, and just enjoy the ride. Professor, talking about what got you into being a lawyer and to getting into this profession, what was your journey up until this point?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I always knew I wanted to work in international relations, international law. And like many people who want to work in that area, it wasn't very clear to me what that career path would look like. But I eventually found it through law, through academia, and it's been a great journey. And now I get to teach international law, I get to write about international law, do a little bit of consulting here and there in the area. But I also get to work with and engage with bright young students such as yourself. So in many ways, it's a dream job for me.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Obviously, I try my best to be participative, and obviously, clearly, I'm not talking about no hash browns and muffins in my class, but
we have some fun.
Yeah, absolutely. But Professor, I want to kind of ask, what kind of got you into teaching, into what kind of wanted to, I guess, teach and kind of be on this side of things in terms of that.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I say, it was sort of a vehicle. Academia, being a prof, was a vehicle to do some of the things I was really interested in. And I didn't know how much I would like teaching. It turned out to be something I consider to be my vocation. And I've taught it in a variety of places. I came to, what I would say more conventional academia after several experiences teaching in the Balkans and the Caucasus in post-conflict situations. Where law teaching felt not only like something that was intellectually fun, but also it was a way of helping students work through the post-conflict environment that they found themselves in. And that was really rewarding, and I learned a lot about the possibilities and limits of international engagement in post-conflict zones. So, for example, while I was working for an international organization in Kosovo, I went down to the University of Pristina one day and offered to teach a course there. And this was right after the NATO bombings. It was the first time a lot of students were allowed back onto the university campus, and it was a really interesting and it's a teaching experience that stuck with me. So between teaching there, teaching in England, teaching in Canada, I've had a lot of different and a variety of higher education teaching experiences, but I really do consider law teaching to be a vocation and not just something I do when I'm not doing my writing or my other work. It's a vocation, and I've been law teaching for 26 years now, and so it's something that I take a lot of interest in, and I don't always get it right. I know that, but I always do try to engage with my students in a way that's relational. I think the best law teaching is relational. There's so much legal information on the web right now or through artificial intelligence that it's not the information that needs to be passed on, but problem solving, creative thinking, and law as a relational subject is really where I find it richest. And so while the law teaching has evolved over those 26 years, I still very much consider it to be a vocation and one that I take a lot of pride in.
That's incredible. Yeah, and then obviously even hearing the number one piece of feedback I hear when it comes to the way you teach is just that relatability, that kind of ability to kind of connect and resonate with others. I'm curious to know, you mentioned that international law was one of your specialties. What's something that you think people sometimes get sort of misconstrued, or something about international law that that you the most common kind of thing you have to kind of correct or think in your mind, that's kind of something that people don't really know about the pre-field?
Well, I think, quite understandably, people look at the failures of the international legal system. They're blatant, right? War would be mankind's, biggest failure.
Yeah.
And to some extent, then that's a failure of the international legal system.
Wow.
I think what people often don't understand is how often international law on a daily basis just happens.
Wow.
And prevents conflicts. You know, on a daily basis, Canadian courts are implementing international law domestically, and so it's not, in that sense, a foreign subject at all. It's something that's sort of the bread and butter of the Canadian judicial system, but internationally as well, whether it be the law of the sea or air and space law, or the regulation of the regulation of fisheries in the Detroit River and the Great Lakes. International law impacts on all of our lives on a daily basis in most instances, and I don't think people realize the pervasiveness of it.
Wow.
Now, Mo, you and your colleagues are in the dual JD program, and so there'll be, by its very nature, a transnational dimension to the kind of learning you do. But often I think we don't, especially in first year, talk enough about the international or transnational context within which law happens.
Wow.
So I think that actually is one of the real strengths of the dual JD program.
That's another plug. Shout out to Windsor and UDM for that.
I like how I
Yeah, absolutely. We have to slide a little bit of the plug there. But so that's interesting to know. And obviously, like you mentioned, international laws is kind of complex, and a lot of times, different. It's important to kind of keep different factors into consideration with that. So in terms of teaching, in terms of the way you kind of the amount of students that you've kind of come in, what do you think? Obviously, this is like an anonymous question that from someone that may or may not be interviewing you right now. That may or may not be in your class, But what do you think is something that you think separates a great student from someone who let's say kind of performs average or kind of is just okay in a class, because it's a fundamental class for most law students, I guess, in North America and abroad.
Mm-hmm. Can I give you two things?
Yeah.
All right. The first is that students who understand that law is not just a series of rules, but a series of, in some ways, of course there are contours that we work within, constraints that we work within and thankfully work within and get to work within, but that there's a lot of room for creativity, for law as argumentation and advocacy and creativity, that it's not about just uncovering the rule, but exercising judgment, exercising practical wisdom. The students who are able to get to that often do very well on my exams, but I think more importantly, set themselves up for legal practice.
Right.
And I would say the second thing is, and this is more of a habit as opposed to an approach, but is actually applying the law to fact patterns, to issues. One bad idea on paper is better than 10 good ideas in your head.
Right.
I remember sitting 30 years ago in my first year law school class going, yeah, I get this, I get that, I understand everything so far. And then the December exams happened, and I realized I really didn't understand it in a way that allowed me to translate it into actual problem solving on paper, and it was on paper then.
Oh.
So I think just continually expressing yourself through writing, ideally with fact patterns or hypotheticals, is a way that allows students to not just have the knowledge, but to be able to transform it, to apply it. And I think that's where a kind of richness happens. Again, not only in terms of doing well in law school, but in terms of setting yourself up for the writing that you'll do through the rest of your practice in one form or another.
Wow. What do you think is something that an expectation or a lack thereof, I guess a better way to put it is something that people can kind of misconstrue about the work of actually being a lawyer, that a law student like myself who probably got his impression watching Suits, things what do you think is a common misconception about the practice of law that people usually find?
I mean, maybe that there's only one way of practicing law, or even a couple of ways of practicing law. People often think, well, you do courtroom advocacy, and that's what law is. Well, of course, then in the first year of law school, you learn that there's actually a lot of transactional work that takes place. I think, though, people don't realize beyond the barrister or solicitor type approaches, that there's just a huge number of not only areas of practice, but ways of practicing, approaches to practice, and that people can find their niche, right? So some will find it in courtroom advocacy, others will find it in mediation, others will find it in community organizing, others will find it in consulting, others will find it not in law altogether, or in a way that's adjacent to law but is not directly implicating legal practice. So I think what I certainly didn't understand, and I suspect a lot of first years don't get, is the range of possibilities of where the degree can take you.
For sure. Interesting. And curious to know, as a professor, you probably have an interesting view of the class where you kind of just see everyone at the same time and all that. Can you like actively tell if someone's zoning out? Because I've always wondered, like, sometimes, obviously I'd never zone out in your class or anyone else. I'd never zone out any of my law classes, any of it, never that, never at all, never that. But I'm curious to know, can you tell if someone, like, can you have like a gauge, even without even saying anything, of like people who are engaged and who are not?
Yeah, I remember thinking as a law student, boy, the prof must hate the keeners who sit in the front row and put up their hand all the time. Yeah. But but at least they give you some kind of feedback, and so I've really come to appreciate the keeners. But there are always dark horses in the class, and when you get the exam results back and they're translated from the anonymous number to the person, and you start to think, well, I didn't hear from this person the entire year. They've done best in the class. So my ability to gauge who's fully on top of the materials is not as good as I like to think it is. But I really, the more serious point is, I really do genuinely appreciate engagement. Right. It just makes it so much more interesting for everybody. As you know, we teach in the afternoon after we teach and learn in the afternoon after lunch, and it can be a sleepy period, and you have a heavy schedule, and so I don't actually mind terribly when I see people kind of drifting off a little bit. It's hard to maintain attention for a couple of hours, and ideally, profs will change up the way in which they're teaching to catch different people with different learning styles at different points in the classroom, at different times during the classroom, or over the course of the semester at least. So switching it up is important from the prof's perspective as well, to keep our interest in the materials. But I genuinely do appreciate when people are engaged, and for the most part they are. And one of the fun things about teaching contracts is that a lot of people come into law school thinking it's not going to be that interesting. Right. And then when they realize that contracts are pervasive, and that they've already been contracting parties, they've already been legal actors, they get into it, and they often apply it to real world situations, and so it's a fun course to teach, even though it's not my area of academic specialty. I've been teaching it for a long time, and I really do enjoy it. What's something as a professor that you think you kind of, like, from your perspective, you'd wish students would kind of know? I suppose I would go back to what I said a moment ago regarding the idea that law is not just a series of rules or propositions. The more students can genuinely digest the material, the better their answers will be on exams. But more importantly, they'll start thinking like a lawyer, but not just like any lawyer or a generic lawyer, but a lawyer with practical wisdom, a lawyer with judgment, a lawyer with creativity, a lawyer who has good relational and interpersonal skills. And so it's that complete lawyer that I think many of us are ultimately interested in educating or being a small part of their formation. And so, again, students will often come up to me at the end of a class or at the end of a case and say, well, what was the rule? And sometimes there's a clear rule. I don't want to pretend that it's all just up in the air. It's all, but sometimes there's a clear rule, but often it's not so much the rule that I want you to take away, but the framework for thinking about the problem that I want you to take away. I want you to take away like an approach to the problem, as opposed to the nugget that you get to write at the bottom of your notes. As important as that can be, I don't want to again take away from the importance of doctrine or rules, but there is an iterative nature, a contingent nature to a lot of what we're talking about. In contract law, a lot of the rules are pretty clear. You need to have offer and acceptance. But as we've already seen in just a couple of classes, that gets messy too, right? When you're talking about auctions or tendering or terms and conditions flying back and forth between companies. It gets messy, but it's in that messiness that the richness can come out as well. And so, I suppose not to be afraid of the messy cases, not to just be focused on the bottom line.
And so, just speaking on contracts, what's like the most common contractual error or issue that you find most people either like run into or that tends to come up?
Well, one of the things we're going to do this year is do a contract drafting exercise, because we teach contract law, like many of our first year subjects, in kind of a funny way, right? Where we look at what courts say about contracts, as opposed to asking maybe from the ground up what contracting looks like. So we are going to have a portion of the class on contract drafting, and one of the things that I'll stress then is the importance of clear writing, of clear drafting. There's this sense that to properly have a contract, you've got to put in some wherefores and to witness and thereofs, and there's certainly a place for precision, but there's no need to use archaic language, and in fact, using language rather that obfuscates can often lead us into trouble. So clarity in writing, whether it be, and here the example I'm giving is contract drafting, but more broadly, clarity in writing on an exam or a hypothetical, or in drafting a contract or drafting an application letter, is maybe more important than people realize.
For sure. Final question I'll ask you is, if you weren't doing international law or contracts law and you had to pick a particular area of practice, what would be the area of expertise that you would have probably gone if you hadn't specialized in those two fields first?
Well, I have a sideline in cycling law.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's my sideline in cycling law. I'm the author of a book on cycling law in Canada, which I inherited from two colleagues at the University of Ottawa. I did the second edition, they did the first. And I'm more and more convinced that we need to bring active transportation, walking, cycling, other forms of micromobility more squarely into our transportation mix. In an era of climate change, I think it's an existential issue. We really need to rethink our dependence on the car. And so in a small way, by making cycling a legal subject, I hope to be contributing to that. And more generally, I've been involved in advocacy around active transportation. I'm working on a project right now around the dangers of oversized autos, in particular the dangers that high front hoods pose to pedestrians and cyclists. And so looking at the possibilities of regulation, whether it be something as simple as warning purchasers of these vehicles that they pose a safety risk to those outside their vehicles. I think many people who drive pickups and large SUVs right now don't realize that they're putting their neighbors, their loved ones, as well as total strangers at a great deal of risk on our roadways. So working on those kinds of issues is a passion of mine. And so if I wasn't, and when I'm not doing international law or teaching contract law, I do a lot of thinking and writing about cycling. I also have a passion for local history.
That's cool.
So maybe I would be a historian.
That's cool. Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining me. Ladies and gentlemen, Billable Time, Professor Chris Waters. Best in the world. Thank you so much.